I'm Phil Bleasy. This is my Morgan three-wheeler. Welcome to my Morgan three-wheeler workshop, which is a YouTube channel which contains videos which will help you to understand what makes these things tick. It will also help you to carry out routine maintenance and servicing tasks, minor repairs, and it explains all about the upgrades that I make for the drivetrain. I make an upgrade for the cush drive on the crankshaft, the centre cush drive. I make an upgrade for the bevel box mountings, and I also make a chain drive conversion for the back end. These I install for you, or you can come and work with me in my workshops and we'll install them together. If you want to see all the rest of my videos, more hints and tips and little bits and pieces you can carry out to improve the vehicle and to improve your Morgan three-wheeler experience, then please go down to the bottom of the page or just below this video, click on the subscribe button. Or if you don't want to do that, just remember the words Morgan three-wheeler workshop and put them in the search engine at the top. That'll get you to this channel. Otherwise, you might like to look at my website, which is www.bleasy.co.uk. Enjoy your experience. Happy three-wheelering. Bye. How to get the engine out. Right, well, the first thing we've got to do is get the bonnet off. Put that away somewhere carefully so it doesn't get damaged. An important safety issue here before you do any work on any motor vehicle, the Morgan three-wheeler is no exception. Disconnect the battery earth lead. That way there can't be any silly accidents. When you put the battery earth lead back on again, you'll find you'll have lost the time setting, but the mileometer and the trip meter remain unchanged. Make sure that battery earth lead is tucked down right out of the way, and don't forget when you reconnect it, there will be one or two bits and pieces in the vehicle still connected. You have the risk of a tiny spark. Make sure there's no petrol about before you reconnect that lead when you've finished work. Down here you'll find a pair of leads which plug into a socket. These are the feed for the fan, the electric fan. They're very tight to get out. Hi Jude. Hi. I've got to go and get some tadpoles. These two wires here are coloured black and blue, and you'll see on the socket there is a little red positive marker which is for the blue cable. If yours isn't marked, mark it up so you can get them back the right way round, because they can be put together wrongly. Once that's disconnected, we can then remove the holding down bolts for the fan. These are imperial bolts, so you'll need an imperial Allen key. They're stainless steel, quite soft, button heads with a small socket in, so don't try and do it with the wrong size Allen key. You could easily round out the hexagon. And you can lift the fan free, pull out the connector, and don't forget to keep the two aluminium spacers. Then we can disconnect the two petrol pipes, which are down at the bottom. The connectors are on the elbow, and on the back there's a little piece that you can press in. Once that's depressed, then you can just pull it apart. I always mark one of them so I know which way round to put the two pipes when I put them back. I'm not sure how important it is, but I do it anyway. There's the second one. This spills a little drop of petrol, so make sure you've got your fire extinguisher handy and don't have a cigarette light. Coming now to the top of the engine, two cables to the fuel injectors are removed by pushing that clip in to pull them off. Just need to get something in there. Push the clip in, pull the cable off. The one to the left hand cylinder is always marked with a white tape. If yours isn't, I suggest you make some sort of mark on there before you forget which one is which. When you come to remove the throttle cable, a little wire with a loop in the end of it is handy. There's a button down there you can pull just to move the disc round. That enables you to get some slack in the cable. Just put your piece of wire over there to hold it up. Then you can reach down underneath to get the nipple out. The rest of the electrical connections are more or less unique. You won't get them muddled up, so they don't need to be marked. They all have little clips that you pull back to get them out. You can see the seals are colour coded. Some of them easier to reach than others. And then once we've got them all unplugged, I use our friendly bit of wire and just tie them back out of the way. Then down here we have a knock sensor, which is bolted directly into the cylinder head. Be careful not to lose the little metal tab when you disconnect that bit. That just leaves us with two HT leads to remove and a little pipe that comes over here off the throttle body, which you just pull off. There's no clip on it, just spit on it before you put it back. And now we're ready to go underneath and start disconnecting under there. Okay, this is where I introduce my glamorous assistant Claire.
Hi!
You need to get the jack just to the left as you're looking at the car, so on the starboard side of the vehicle, as it were, where it will balance, but always have someone on hand just in case you lose the balance, because you've only got one wheel at the back, and if it tips over sideways, there's a very good chance that it'll come tumbling off the jack and do some damage. Axle stands under the main chassis tubes. Towards the middle of the vehicle, because that way you will later be able to get the engine crane in. So two axle stands nicely positioned underneath the vehicle, handbrake on, and the other thing we're going to do is to introduce something underneath to prevent any chance of an accident should the vehicle come off the axle stands. I do like belt and braces when it comes to saving people's lives. So the vehicle firmly supported on two axle stands under the main chassis members, and you'll notice in the background I've got a car ramp under the middle, just in case the thing were to come off the axle stands. At least that way whoever's underneath it might be seriously embarrassed but not killed. Okay, so now we're underneath the vehicle. There are two connectors here that have to be taken out. This big one, which is for the alternator, and a little one down here, which is for the oil pressure switch. Some vehicles don't have that oil pressure switch connector, and you have to take the cable off the nut that's fixing it to the end of the switch. Okay, so now to the front of the engine, and here you've got the rev counter sensor. I've made up a little wooden plug with an O-ring that goes in there. Keep the dirt out. You can stuff a bit of rag in it or a bit of paper or something. But don't let any dirt get in. We've now got to disconnect here the earth lead for the rectifier. Over the back here, two bolts which hold the rectifier mounting onto the chassis, and two more underneath, and then the rectifier will drop down on the end of its cables. Something that I may not have made perfectly clear earlier on: the petrol pipe connectors have on the outside of the elbow a little button that you press in that fashion, and then they just slide apart. When you put them back together, just push the petrol pipe in there, push it till it clicks, job done. So here's the rectifier removed, hanging back on its wires. Just take a note of the fact that all of those wires go over the top of the chassis tube, underneath the engine mounting plate, behind the oil filter. It can be a bit embarrassing later on when you put the engine in, if you get those in the wrong place and they won't quite reach. Now on the left hand side of the vehicle, just below the end of the oil tank, we can see down there is the top mounting bolt for the starter motor. We have to remove this because it's got an earth strap on it. Make sure when you take it off you tie the earth strap up somewhere so you don't lose it when the engine goes back in. Okay, so now all the electrics are disconnected. We now have the oil pipes to sort. This top one is just a breather. Undo the Jubilee clip, pull it off. Pull it out of its two P clips. That'll save you riveting new ones on later. Two oil pipes, again, slacken off the Jubilee clip, pull them off. I make up a 14mm diameter wooden plug that just pops in the end there. That way we don't lose all the oil. You'll see, once these are off and out of the way, the crankcase is clearly marked return and supply. The return pipe obviously is the one that goes in the top of the oil tank. The supply pipe is the one that comes out of the bottom. Full. The next thing, good idea if the vehicle's been standing for some time to run the engine up for a couple of minutes a little while before doing this job, and then you don't end up with a whole crankcase full of oil in the drip tray. As you can see, all we've lost here is maybe half a cupful. The next thing we're going to do is turn our attention to the steering rack. The comfort kit that Morgan fit to get the steering geometry right, and we're going to take that apart first. Make a careful note of the two stainless steel spacers. They have tapered ends, both of which point towards the ball joint. I find it useful at this point to wrap something protective around the exhaust pipe, because now that the track rod end is removed and loose, that mudguard will damage itself if you let it hit the exhaust pipe. When you put the comfort pack back in, take note that it assembles with the two tapered ends of the spacers facing towards the track rod end or steering rod end, which goes in here. The next thing we have to address is the mounting for the steering rack. That's this arm here, which has to be removed. That top bolt has to come out. In order to get it out, we need to undo the bolt through the top of the suspension unit. We don't need to remove that bolt entirely, but just take the nut off and push it back out of the way so that we can then withdraw this bolt. This spare washer that's laying over here is a mystery. Moving now down to the underside of the vehicle, you can see here the steering rack mounting bracket and the bottom bolt going through here. Same on the other side, obviously. We need to get those out next. The third and final bolt through these mounting brackets for the steering rack lies in here, and it's difficult because it's behind the vertical chassis tube, so you need a knuckle joint in your socket set, and it's also got a bolt in it that is over length, so you need an extra deep 16mm socket to get on it. Okay, so having barked your knuckles on all the nuts and bolts to get this thing free, the next thing you've got to do is to remove it from the brackets on the chassis, and the way to do this is to get a wooden stick or some other thing that's not going to do it any damage, knock it back at the bottom first, and then pull it towards the middle of the car, and if you were really lucky you'd get it to come off, but you see the principle. So now we've got these two steering rack support brackets out, we can see that they are possibly one of the worst engineered parts of the vehicle. The top here, you can see the bracket is bent out where it runs up against a weld on the chassis. That's the same on both of them. So you can see it's quite clearly bent out at the end. And these two holes are not drilled clearance for the bolts that go through them. They are so tight you will not have any chance of getting them back together again unless you drill those out a millimetre bigger before you reassemble it. They are handed because here are P-clips which I've cut to get the brake pipe and the lambda sensor connector cable out. When you put them back together, make sure that this side with the drillings for the clips is on the outside. And as you can see, the bolts that go in here are just impossible in this situation when they're tucked inside the car and you can't even see them and you can only work with your fingertips. You will not get it together unless you drill them out. We now have to remove the bolt that holds the steering column onto the rack, and that pinch nut there is the one we have to undo. When you put it back in, you must notice that it goes through a groove in the shaft. I will show you that groove very shortly. There, now you can quite clearly see, now that the steering column has been withdrawn, the groove around the splined shaft there. You must be sure that when the bolt goes through there, when you reassemble it, that bolt passes through the groove so that the thing can't come apart. As you pull the steering column off, there's the universal joint, you telescope it back into itself at this point here. Now to actually withdraw the steering rack itself, we have to rotate it anti-clockwise, remove the fixing bolts from either end, having done that, continue to rotate it, watching out for wires and oil pipes. Until that spline shaft for the steering column is pointing downwards and forwards. You can now carefully extract the whole thing and put it to one side. Moving now to the back of the vehicle, take out the fixing screws all round, remove the parcel tray, and then in here, and get you in closer so you can see them. Right up there are 4 screws, one above the other here, 2 on the other side, which hold in the upper seat back. Remove those screws. And once those screws are removed, lift out the seat squabs. Swivel the seatbelt fastenings forward and down on both sides. I like to put the seatbelts up here and out of the way. And then lift the bottom part of the seat. He said. Lift that out, so. And now we're in a position to remove 4 screws at the back of the prop shaft tunnel, the ones at the bottom here, and the ones along the side of the gearbox housing. Okay, now before we can get these gearbox and transmission tunnel covers off, we need to remove the gear knob, screw down that bottom ring. Underneath it you will find 3 tiny grub screws. You don't need to take them all the way out. Just pull, when you've got the 3 grub screws loose, just pull the gear knob straight up off that plastic sleeve. There you can see the 3 grub screws, which are normally hidden underneath that screwed ring. Handbrake knob comes off, screwing it off by hand. We can then lift out the prop shaft tunnel and lucky the cover off the gearbox. We now have to remove the pedal box, or at least take the bolts out so we can shift it to one side, and a row of bolts along the top and bottom of these plastic side panels. I'm now removing the 2 triangular panels, one on each side. It's good to remember that this last screw the middle one on that side can't be accessed, you can't get it in and out with the prop shaft in place. So make sure you put that screw back in before you drop the prop shaft down. If you're unfortunate enough to have a pedal box like this one, which is held down with Allen cap head screws which are not fixed, you will need, in order to undo them, a tool like this. So now we're looking in the passenger side or left hand side of the car. We need to remove 1, 2, 3 bolts from the plastic panel beside the gearbox. The same 3 bolts have to come out on the other side, but they're more difficult to see because the pedal box is still in place. So having removed those 3 bolts, some vehicles have that panel glued in with mastic top and bottom. This one is no exception. And I've used the Stanley knife to cut through the mastic, not all the way to the front, only down as far as that first bend in the chassis tube there, so that we can now carefully pull that panel back, and right up the front there you can see the 1 bolt on the left hand side which has to be removed in order to get the bolts out round the bell housing. There you can see it a little bit more clearly right in the centre of the picture. On the pedal box side things are a lot tighter for space and unfortunately on this side there are 2 bolts to get out. You can see them there, one above the other, just past the wooden stick that I've used to hold the plastic casing back. These 3 bolts, as you can see from the marks on them, are fully threaded and inserted quite a long way. So there's a lot of winding to do to get them out, and you will need all the extensions from your socket set stacked together to make an overall length of 3 feet or nearly a metre in order to get your ratchet clear of the dashboard. Good luck. The 3 worst bolts from the bell housing are now removed. There's only 1 remaining at the top, and you can see it there underneath the oil tank. This is the longest of the bolts in the bell housing, and the reason it is longer is so that when you put the car back together you can get that one in, screw it in a few threads as a guide to line up the others as you push the bell housing home. Underneath the vehicle again, the last 3 bolts in the bell housing are 1, 2, 3. 2 of them, as you can see, are socket cap heads, come out from the front, and the middle one is an ordinary hexagon headed bolt which you remove from the back. Here you can see the exhaust pipe nuts secured with studs into the cylinder head, and as you can see there's a tab washer there. Some careful work required with a small chisel to straighten those tab washers up, and they are 1/2 inch AF nuts, very difficult to get on if unfortunately, like this vehicle, you've got one with a run of weld round the top of the exhaust pipe. It gets in the way. You will possibly find a socket spanner turned down in the lathe will fit it. You may have to try and do it with an open-ended spanner. In any case, I wish you luck. You should examine the locking tabs for the exhaust pipe securing nuts at this stage, and you'll see that these ones have been used, but there are still areas where we can get another tab lock out of them, so you don't need to buy new ones if they're like this, but if you find yours have been used and nearly demolished, get some new ones now. With all the bell housing bolts now out of the gearbox, we put the trolley jack underneath, just tight enough to take the weight of the gearbox, no more. We don't want to be pushing it up in the air at this stage. Leave the trolley jack under there to keep the weight of the gearbox supported until we put the engine back in. Now's the time to start undoing engine mounting bolts, and so we need to get the engine supported. This is the S&S supplied engine lifting bracket. You may have to improvise something in its place, but be aware that the two bolts that hold it in, these ones at the end here, are 1/2 inch American National coarse threads. UNC will fit. Be wary if you've got old nuts and bolts lying around that the 1/2 inch size is the one where the pitch is different between UNC and Whitworth. Don't try and use Whitworth ones. And here's the lifting bracket in position, bolted on at both ends. Make sure the bolts are tight and that the lifting bracket is tight, not able to wobble about at all in the middle. Don't let the bolts be too long so that they bottom in the holes, and then you've got a fairly safe thing to lift with. Here we are with the engine crane attached. You can see I use a sling between the engine crane and the lifting bracket. When you first put the crane on, take out the slack, just start to take the weight, but be very careful. This is only a light vehicle. Don't accidentally lift it up off the axle stands. Now we've got the engine crane on. We've got mounting bolts to get out. 2 long ones there, vertical ones. There are 4 here through the rubber mountings, 2 on each side. The other side of the engine, 2 more vertical ones. You'll find that these are unfortunately very long with nylon nuts on. You have to spanner them all the way off, which is a pain. 2 more of those, front and back. And then behind the engine, in there, if you can see them, I'll get a light on for you, there are 3 on each side bolts holding the bell housing onto the same engine plates. Those 6, 3 on each side, also need to come out. The best procedure is to take out the vertical ones and these 6 at the back and leave these 4 through the rubber mountings until last. When you've got the vertical engine bolts out and the 6 at the back that go into the bell housing, it's a good idea just to lift the engine 1/2 inch or so with the crane, so there's a little gap there. That makes it easier to get these bolts out here at the front, and the ones at the back as well. Now, having got the engine lifted up a bit further, all the bolts free, we should be able to lift these awful things somehow or other to the point where they will drop out through the bottom. The one on the other side, I have to tell you, is no easier. Now we can just drop the engine a little bit, keeping the exhaust pipes. You can leave the exhaust pipes mounted on the vehicle, just pull them clear on either side. Make sure nothing else is hooked up. And we just want to pull the engine forward 1 inch and no more. Get it free from the gearbox. Just make sure we've got the gearbox supported by the trolley jack. Drop the engine a little bit, although you can't drop it too far, because the oil pump, the oil filter, will foul on that front chassis member. Okay, that's forward about 1 inch. Now we have to go back to the starter motor, and you can see here there's a cable. You have to bend this clip up, cut that cable tie, and underneath I've got to show you, but in there, that red cable, you can now get on the nut fairly easily. Disconnect that before you pull the engine forward any further. Righty-ho, starter motor disconnected. Now just start carefully pulling the engine forward. You need to just tweak the gearbox up and down a bit. Find that possibly the oil pipes where they go across the car in front of the oil tank will catch. And just stop you bringing the engine forward for a moment or two. You just juggle it up and down. Those oil pipes out of the way. It's important now to watch the plastic insulator on the front of the starter motor. We don't want to break that by pulling it too hard past the chassis tubes. And if you just turn the engine slightly sideways, back up a bit. Bring the engine forward slowly, bring it up a bit. And as all the best circus performers say, ta-da! I have a wooden cradle made up to accept the engine, a couple of bolts to go through it just to keep it all secure. And if you're going to do a lot of work on the engine, and we certainly are on this one, modifying the centre coupling, then I would suggest you make up something similar.